I never thought a simple hiking trip would lead to something so terrifying. I was just trying to enjoy a few days in the wilderness, but what happened in those woods still haunts me to this day. It all started when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through a remote trail in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd been hiking for years, and although I'd always enjoyed the company of friends, there was something about the idea of being alone in nature that appealed to me. The plan was simple: pack light, head into the woods for a few days, and disconnect from everything. The trail I chose was isolated, known for its beauty but rarely traveled, perfect for someone like me who wanted peace and solitude. The first day went smoothly. I arrived at the trailhead just after dawn, the air crisp and cool. The forest was quiet, except for the sound of leaves crunching beneath my boots. Birds chirped high in the trees, and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush reminded me I wasn't alone. I was at peace, enjoying the quiet hum of the forest. By the time dusk approached, I had already set up camp at a small clearing near a stream. I built a fire, cooked some dinner, and sat back to watch the stars appear in the night sky. There was no one around for miles, no sounds of other hikers or campers, just the whispering of the wind through the trees. That night, though, something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but I felt watched. My eyes kept darting toward the edge of the clearing, where the darkness of the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. I kept hearing things, small twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but when I checked, there was nothing there. It wasn't animals either. It was as if something was intentionally trying to be quiet, as if it didn't want to be noticed. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I was alone in the woods, and sometimes the mind plays tricks on you in the silence of nature. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept racing. Every now and then, I would wake to the sound of something heavy moving just outside the perimeter of the camp, just out of sight. Each time I'd get up to check, there would be nothing but the cold air and the quiet darkness. After hours of tossing and turning, I eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I packed up my gear, eager to get moving and put the unsettling night behind me. But as I started hiking again, things took a strange turn. The deeper I went into the forest, the more things began to feel wrong. The trees, which had once seemed so peaceful, now looked dark and menacing. The path that had been clear and easy to follow the day before was now overgrown with brambles and vines, and I had to push through the thick vegetation just to continue. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in hours. I checked my map, but something was off. The paths didn't look the same. I had crossed a few streams, yes, but now I couldn't recognize any of the landmarks. I was starting to feel lost. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing through the trees. They weren't like the scurrying of an animal, but the sound of a human walking through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" But there was no answer, just the sound of the footsteps growing closer. I froze. I felt like I wasn't alone anymore, but the woods were too dense to see anyone approaching. I took a few cautious steps backward, not wanting to alert whoever or whatever was out there. I kept my eyes peeled, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. The footsteps stopped. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was too afraid. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence. Then, just as I was about to exhale in relief, I heard a whisper. A soft, almost inaudible whisper carried by the wind. "Leave this place." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart pounded. I spun around expecting to see someone standing right behind me, but there was nothing. I was alone. But the voice, it felt like it came from the trees, as though they were alive, watching me. I turned and ran. My mind raced. I didn't even bother looking at the map anymore. I just followed the trail, hoping I was headed in the right direction. The footsteps started again, echoing behind me, quickening with every step I took. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing. I stumbled through the underbrush, desperately trying to find my way out. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the woods were growing darker by the second. My breath was ragged as I pushed myself forward, but it felt like the trees were closing in, like the forest itself was trapping me. Suddenly, I heard a voice again, this time closer, clearer, more urgent. "Turn back." This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a command, a voice that didn't belong to any living thing. I felt it deep in my bones, a chill crawling through me. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind had finally snapped from the isolation, but I couldn't ignore it. The voice was unmistakable. I stopped dead in my tracks. I turned, my eyes darting in every direction. The forest was still, too still. And then just beyond the trees, I saw it, a figure. A pale, shadowy silhouette, barely visible in the dimming light. It was standing motionless, watching me. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the vastness of the forest. I bolted, running faster than I ever had in my life. The footsteps followed, but now they weren't behind me. They were all around me, closing in, like something was chasing me. The forest seemed endless. I didn't know where I was anymore. My legs burned, my breath came in ragged gasps, and I could barely see through the darkness. But the figure was still there, lurking at the edge of my vision, always just out of reach. And the footsteps, they grew louder, faster, as though something was just behind me, waiting for me to stumble. Finally, I saw light, a clearing. I pushed myself toward it, praying for some sign of civilization. I burst out of the trees, gasping for breath, and collapsed onto the ground. I was trembling, drenched in sweat, but the strange feeling of being watched didn't leave. It wasn't until I stood up that I noticed something horrifying. The clearing was full of abandoned campfires, and each one had been left in the exact same state, smoldering embers, no sign of anyone who had used them. But the strangest part was the markings. Strange symbols were etched into the ground around each fire, marks I couldn't decipher, but that made my blood run cold. That's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The forest wasn't just watching me, it was waiting. And whatever had been following me was still out there. I didn't look back as I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, parked at the trailhead, the sun finally setting behind me. I didn't speak to anyone for days. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened, because I knew they wouldn't believe me. I don't know what it was that followed me through the woods that day. Some say it's just a legend, a ghost story told around campfires. But I know what I felt, what I saw, and it still chills me to think about it. If you ever find yourself hiking alone in the Appalachian Mountains, take my advice, don't venture too far off the trail, and never listen to the whispers in the wind, because sometimes the forest doesn't want you to leave.
Next story.
I'll never forget that day. The day I made the mistake of hiking alone in the woods. It was supposed to be a peaceful day, just me, nature, and the sound of the birds. But it ended up being the most terrifying experience of my life, one that still haunts me. It was late in the afternoon when I left my car parked at the trailhead. The sun was low, casting a golden light over everything, and the air was crisp with the promise of fall. I'd been itching for some alone time to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. There's something calming about the woods, the smell of pine and damp earth, the way the leaves crunch underfoot. It felt like the perfect way to escape. At first, everything seemed normal. The path was wide and clear, marked with easy-to-spot signs for the occasional hiker. I walked for a couple of hours, the only sounds being my footsteps and the distant calls of birds. But soon I noticed the trees growing thicker, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural ways. The sunlight barely filtered through anymore, and the air felt colder, almost damp. I paused for a moment, a slight unease creeping up my spine. I had read about strange disappearances in the woods, but I didn't believe in that kind of stuff. There was no reason to worry. I kept going, deciding to take a different route to make the hike more interesting. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods felt alive, but not in a comforting way. It was as though the trees were watching me, their branches stretching out as if to grab me. I looked behind me once or twice, half expecting to see something, or someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. I pushed on, telling myself I was just being paranoid. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the bushes. Soft but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped in my tracks, straining my ears. The sound came again, closer this time. I turned slowly, expecting to see a deer or some other animal, but instead I saw nothing. Just the darkening woods stretching out before me. I took a few more steps, my senses on high alert. The rustling continued, but it wasn't from any animal I'd ever heard before. It was something else, like the sound of feet dragging through the leaves. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I turn back? I hesitated, but the path seemed so familiar, and I had no reason to believe anything was wrong. So I kept moving forward, faster now, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with each step. Then, out of nowhere, I felt a cold breath on my neck. I froze. The air was too still, too quiet. For a long moment, I didn't dare move, afraid that if I did, whatever was behind me would make itself known. The breath was so cold, like winter had suddenly arrived, and I felt it crawl down my spine, a feeling of dread washing over me. I turned quickly, but again, there was nothing, just the empty woods. I told myself I was being stupid. I had to get out of there. I needed to leave before I lost my mind. So I spun around and began to walk briskly back to the trail. But as I hurried down the path, I felt something else. A presence. Something following me, just out of sight. I couldn't hear it, but I could feel it. The hairs on my arms stood up, and my heart raced. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, my nerves, the isolation getting to me. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. And then I heard it again, the dragging sound. I whipped around, but this time I saw something, a figure, tall, shrouded in shadows, standing at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its eyes on me. The air seemed to grow heavier, suffocating. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed up. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I took a step back, but the figure stayed rooted to the spot. It was like the woods themselves were holding it in place. I turned away, not daring to look back, and sprinted down the path. But the figure didn't follow. I thought I had escaped. I was wrong. Minutes later, I stumbled upon the clearing. It was a small, desolate place, the ground bare except for a few scattered rocks. I had passed through here earlier, but now it felt different. The trees felt closer, like they were crowding in on me, and the sunlight seemed to have disappeared entirely. I could barely see my surroundings. And then I heard it again, the dragging. Closer now, right behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, and that's when I saw it, no longer in the shadows, but standing there, fully revealed. It was an old woman. Her clothes were tattered, like they had been worn for years. Her face was pale, gaunt, the skin tight against her bones, and her eyes were empty, hollow black sockets. Her hair hung in stringy clumps around her face, matted and gray. She was dragging herself toward me, her hands reaching out. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out, just a whispering like wind through dry leaves. She didn't walk, she crawled. Her fingers scraped against the earth as she dragged herself closer, inch by inch. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my feet glued to the ground. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't. Her presence was suffocating, overpowering. I watched, horrified, as she came closer and closer, her mouth still moving, the whispered words growing louder, though I couldn't understand them. And then she stopped, right in front of me. I could smell her. The stench of rot, like something dead. My stomach turned and I gagged, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. She reached out, her long, bony fingers brushing against my arm, and I felt an icy chill seep into my skin. Her touch burned like fire and frost all at once. And then the world went black. When I came to, I was lying on the ground, the woods quiet again. The sun had set and the sky was dark. My body was numb, and I couldn't move at first, but I managed to sit up. I was alone. No old woman, no figure, just the silence of the woods. But something had changed. I could feel it, like something had been taken from me. I staggered to my feet, looking around frantically. The path was still there, but it didn't feel like the same place I'd been walking earlier. Everything was wrong. The trees looked unfamiliar, the air heavy. I didn't recognize the landscape anymore, and that's when I heard it again. The dragging. Only this time it wasn't far away. It was right behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran. As fast as I could, my legs burning, my breath ragged in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and when I got in, I didn't even look back at the woods. I just drove. I've never gone back. I don't know what I encountered that day. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was something else, something older, something that had been waiting for me. But I know this. It wasn't just a hallucination. It was real. And it's still out there, waiting in the woods. Sometimes in the dead of night, I can hear the dragging sound again. Just a whisper on the wind, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me again.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a simple weekend hike. My friends and I had been planning it for weeks. A couple of days out in the woods to disconnect, get some fresh air, and just enjoy nature. We'd chosen an area in the Appalachian Mountains, known for its beauty and, yes, its occasional eerie rumors. But like most, we laughed off the stories. Ghosts, haunting, folklore. Nothing to worry about. The trail we picked was one that seemed fairly well traveled, and though it was more isolated than others. Our group consisted of 3 people: me, Jake, and Emily. We were all in our mid-20s, fit enough to handle a moderately difficult hike, and all of us had plenty of outdoor experience. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary when we first set out, so we started off with typical conversations about work, life, and the usual distractions. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, we had covered a decent distance and had planned to camp near a small creek, as it was a great spot to filter water and take a break. We set up our tents, a simple campfire crackling between us. The woods felt calm, almost serene. But I noticed something strange. The deeper we went into the woods, the quieter it became. I know that sounds odd considering we were surrounded by trees and nature, but it was the silence that got to me. Normally, you'd hear birds, rustling leaves, animals scurrying around, maybe the faint sound of wind. But no, there was nothing, an unnatural stillness. Emily noticed it too and joked that maybe it was just how the woods were. It didn't make much sense, but we all let it go. It was getting dark now, so we made ourselves comfortable around the fire. As night fully set in, Jake pulled out a map of the area and suggested we could continue our hike the next day and head up to an old, abandoned lookout tower nearby. I wasn't sure, but I agreed. We didn't really have a set plan for the trip anyway. Emily had been quiet for a while, her face unusually pale, her eyes fixed on the trees behind us. "You guys feel like we're being watched?" she asked, her voice low, as though afraid to disturb whatever it was she was feeling. Jake scoffed, telling her it was just nerves, but I could see she wasn't convinced. I brushed it off too, but something about the air around us just felt off, something I couldn't place. As the fire crackled, Emily stood up abruptly, looking towards the forest. "I swear, I saw someone," she muttered almost to herself. Jake immediately stood up, his voice getting louder. "What do you mean, someone? There's no one out there, Em. It's just your imagination." But Emily was insistent. She started to walk towards the edge of the clearing, and I followed behind her, calling out for her to come back. It was growing late, and the temperature had dropped significantly. We shouldn't be wandering off. When we reached the tree line, Emily stopped dead in her tracks. She was frozen, her hand raised slightly as if trying to signal us to be quiet. I couldn't see anything through the trees, but something felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and an eerie sensation filled the pit of my stomach. Then I heard it, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, just a faint, slow step, like someone walking cautiously but deliberately just beyond our view. We all turned and started to retreat back to the fire, our hearts racing. Emily looked frantic. "There's someone out there. I saw him." Jake laughed, nervously, but there was no mistaking the tension in his voice. "Come on, let's just get back to the camp and forget about it. It's probably some animal or whatever." But as we began to walk back, we all heard the footsteps, following us, deliberately slow, not like an animal. It stopped when we stopped. It moved when we moved. By the time we were back by the fire, Emily was visibly shaken. She sat down quickly, wrapping her arms around herself, and kept glancing toward the trees. I tried to reassure her, but it was no use. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone. We decided to stay near the fire for the rest of the night, though none of us could sleep. Every creak of the trees, every rustling leaf, set us on edge. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually I started to drift in and out of sleep. It was just before dawn when it happened. I woke to a whisper, a soft, unsettling sound that seemed to come from right behind me. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. It was a voice, barely audible but unmistakable. "Get out!" I jumped up, my heart racing, and turned around to see if anyone was behind me. There was nothing, just darkness. I scanned the area, my mind racing. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Jake, who was already awake, his face as pale as mine. Emily was nowhere to be seen. "Em?" I called out, but there was no response. Panic surged through me as I leapt to my feet. "Emily?" Jake and I searched the camp frantically, but there was no sign of her. The tents were still intact, and the fire had died down to embers, but she was gone. I don't know how long we searched, but it felt like hours. There was no trace of her, not even footprints. It was like she had just vanished. Suddenly, we heard something else, something far more terrifying than the whispers. A scream. A long, drawn-out scream that echoed through the woods. The sound of Emily's voice, or at least what was left of it. We ran towards the sound, following it blindly through the trees, stumbling and crashing through the underbrush. The scream echoed again, now desperate. And then we saw her. Emily was standing in the clearing ahead, her back to us. Her hair was wild, her clothes torn, and her eyes were wide and hollow. It looked like she was in some kind of trance. "Emily!" I shouted, rushing towards her. But as I got closer, I noticed something wrong. Her body was swaying unnaturally, her limbs jerking in strange, violent movements. Jake called out to her again, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, staring blankly ahead. And then, with a sudden violent motion, she turned around. Her face wasn't Emily's anymore. It was twisted, like something from a nightmare. Her eyes were black pits, and her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, exposing teeth that were far too long. Her skin was pale, with dark veins running through it, and her breath came in ragged gasps as if she were suffocating. I froze in terror as she took a step toward us, her feet dragging along the ground like she could barely move. I could feel the temperature drop sharply around us, and then, without warning, she lunged. Jake shouted, and we both ran, running through the trees, not looking back. We didn't stop until we reached the trail and then kept running until we found a ranger station hours later. We reported what happened, but no one believed us. They said we must have imagined it. Or maybe we were just lost in the woods. They told us that there were no reports of anyone going missing in that area. But I know what I saw. I can't explain it. And I don't want to go back to those woods. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. I haven't spoken to Jake or Emily since that night. I don't know if Emily is still out there. I don't know if she's even still alive. But one thing I do know for sure, I will never ever go hiking in those woods again.
Next story.
I was a city girl through and through, always surrounded by the buzz of traffic and the convenience of 24/7 stores. But every now and then, I'd get the urge to escape for a while, to get away from the noise and find some peace in nature. So, when my best friend Claire suggested we take a weekend hiking trip in the woods, I agreed, thinking it would be the perfect opportunity to unwind. The trail we picked was known for its serenity, one of those well-maintained paths where hikers go for a few hours, then come back to their cars without a second thought. It was supposed to be easy, nothing extreme. We weren't seasoned hikers, just two girls looking for a break from our hectic lives. The morning we left, the weather was perfect. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything. Claire and I talked excitedly about everything we'd do once we reached the trail, planning out our stop for lunch and making jokes about how we'd probably be back at the car in no time, ready to head home. The woods were quiet, the air fresh, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the gravel as we moved deeper into the trees. At first, the hike was just as expected, peaceful. The forest smelled of earth and pine, and there was a tranquil beauty to it. We took our time, chatting and laughing, stopping to take pictures of the bright wildflowers along the path. We didn't see anyone else on the trail, which was a bit odd for a popular spot, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe people preferred the earlier hours, I thought. But as the morning wore on, I began to feel something shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't obvious at first, but I started to notice that the woods felt different. The trees felt closer, the shadows longer. The path, which had been wide and easy to navigate, now seemed narrower, almost as if it were closing in around us. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a sense of unease crept over me. "Claire," I said, slowing my pace, "do you feel weird?" She looked at me, a little confused. "Weird? What do you mean?" "I don't know. It just feels like something's off." I glanced around, feeling like I was being watched, but the woods looked the same as they always had, quiet, still. Claire gave a half laugh, brushing her dark hair behind her ear. "You're being paranoid. It's just the woods. Relax. It's supposed to feel like this." She was right, of course. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. I shook my head and forced a smile, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like there was something in the air, something pressing down on me, weighing me down. We kept walking, but I felt like the path was never ending. It started to twist and turn in strange ways. It wasn't a circular trail, but I couldn't shake the sense that we were going in circles. I stopped a few times, looking back the way we came, but there were no signs, no familiar landmarks. Are we sure this is the right way? I asked, starting to feel a little nervous. I think so, Claire replied. I mean, there's no sign to indicate otherwise. We're fine. Don't worry so much. But then she stopped. I watched her face shift from casual to concerned, her eyes scanning the trees. She'd felt it too. Do you hear that? She asked quietly. I strained my ears, but all I heard was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. There was no sign of any animals or people. What do you mean? It's like someone's whispering. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. She looked around, her expression tight. I swear I hear someone, like they're calling to us. I froze. Now that she mentioned it, there was something faint in the distance, barely audible. It was a whisper, but not a human one. It sounded more like a hum, low and steady, like a chant. It made my skin crawl. I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Maybe it's just the wind. You know how trees can make strange noises? But Claire was shaking her head. No, it's coming from deeper in the woods. We need to go back. I felt a cold chill go down my spine at the urgency in her voice. She was usually the brave one, the one who'd push us to keep going, no matter what. This wasn't like her. Without waiting for a response, she turned and started walking back the way we'd come. I wanted to follow, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The whispering was getting louder. It was definitely a voice now, distinct and clear, though I still couldn't understand the words. The voice didn't sound like a person. It sounded wrong, like it didn't belong. Claire! I called out, trying to catch up with her, but the sound of my voice only made the whispering intensify, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. I turned, but when I looked back, Claire wasn't there anymore. Claire? I called again, panic rising in my chest. My heart pounded in my ears as I spun around, scanning the trees, trying to make sense of the situation. The woods were quiet once more, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better than to trust that silence. The air was thick with something I couldn't explain, something oppressive. My breath felt shallow as I searched frantically, but there was no sign of her. She had just disappeared. I started running, calling out her name. The woods seemed to shift around me, the path twisting, the trees growing closer together. My feet felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The whispering was louder now, louder than ever before. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens, hundreds, all murmuring the same unintelligible words, calling me deeper. Claire! I screamed, my voice echoing, but it didn't sound like my own voice anymore. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere else, somewhere in the woods. I tripped over a tree root and crashed to the ground, my hands scraping against the earth. When I looked up, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Claire? I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. But it wasn't Claire. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the darkness of the trees, but I could see its eyes, wide, hollow, and unblinking, fixed on me. It stepped forward. I scrambled to my feet and bolted in the other direction, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispering was growing louder, now sounding like voices that were almost within reach, just behind me. But no matter how fast I ran, the figure was always just out of sight, lurking at the edge of my vision. I ran until I couldn't breathe anymore, until my legs gave out beneath me. When I finally stopped, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up. When I did, the woods were silent once more. The whispering had stopped. The figure was gone, and for a moment I thought it had all been a dream. But when I looked around, I realized the truth. I was lost. The trail I had been following was gone. The trees were different now, unfamiliar, as if I had crossed into another world. I didn't dare stay there. I found a small, overgrown path and followed it, hoping it would lead me back to the trail. But it didn't. Hours later, when I finally emerged from the woods, my clothes torn and my body aching, I found myself in a place I didn't recognize. The world felt different. The trees, the air, everything was wrong. But the worst part? I never found Claire, and I never will. I don't hike anymore, not after that day. The woods are silent now, but every now and then, when the wind blows just right, I swear I hear the whispering again. It's calling me back.
Next story.
I had always been one to chase adventure. When I was younger, my friends and I would spend our weekends exploring the woods near our small town. The more remote the location, the better. Abandoned cabins, hidden caves, anything that promised a glimpse into a forgotten world. But as I got older, I grew more cautious. The stories of the strange things lurking in the woods always hung in the back of my mind. Still, it wasn't enough to keep me from taking one last trip into the woods with my old friends. This time, it was just me and Jason, my closest friend from childhood. We decided to tackle a trail that we'd never dared explore back then. A trail that ran deep into the heart of the forest, far beyond the paths we knew. Jason was always the brave one, always pushing me to go further, to seek out the unknown. So when I hesitated, he urged me on, assuring me that it was no different than any of our other trips. We parked at the base of the trail and started out early in the morning, backpacks filled with supplies, our boots crunching against the gravel as we ventured into the thick woods. The further we went, the less we saw of the familiar trail markers. It wasn't long before the path narrowed, the trees closing in around us, making everything feel distant and foreign. I swear, this wasn't here last time. Jason muttered, looking at a sign that seemed hastily nailed to a tree. It was old, worn, and weathered by time, barely legible. The words "Stay on path" were scrawled in faded letters, almost like a warning. Maybe it's just part of the park's guidelines, I said, trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. We'd hiked plenty of trails over the years, and none of them had ever made me feel this uneasy. But Jason was already looking around, scanning the woods. Something doesn't feel right. I've been up here before, and it wasn't like this. We pressed on, though my nerves began to rise. It wasn't just the sign, it was the silence. There were no birds singing, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, just a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow every sound. I could hear my own breath, my heartbeat, and that was it. Every step we took felt like we were moving deeper into something we weren't supposed to. After about an hour of walking, we came across something strange, a stone circle. It wasn't big, but the rocks had clearly been placed there deliberately, not by nature. It looked old, ancient even, and out of place in the middle of the forest. "Okay, that's weird," Jason said, kneeling to inspect it. "I don't remember this being here." "I don't either," I replied, stepping closer. My foot hit a loose stone and it rolled away, revealing something underneath, something dark and wet. I bent down to get a better look and felt my stomach churn. It was a shallow pit filled with what looked like old, decayed bones. I backed away quickly. "Jason, we need to go." Jason wasn't listening. He was kneeling by the circle, running his hand over the rocks. "This doesn't look like something from around here. You think it's—" Before he could finish, I heard something, a voice. Low, murmuring, but distinct. My blood froze in my veins. "Jason, do you hear that?" I whispered. He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something in the distance. "What the hell?" I turned to look in the direction he was staring. At first, I saw nothing, just the same dense trees and shadows. But then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible among the trees. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and dressed in something that looked like tattered dark cloth. "Jason," I said, my voice rising, panic creeping into my chest. "We need to leave, now." Jason finally looked away from the circle and saw the figure. For a moment, he froze, as if he was processing what he was seeing. Then, without a word, he stood up and started backing away slowly. But as we turned to leave, the voice returned, clearer this time. "Don't go." The words were slow, deliberate, like the speaker had all the time in the world. My heart skipped a beat as I felt something cold press against my chest. Jason and I didn't need any more encouragement. We ran. I heard something moving behind us. Not footsteps, but something far more sinister, like the rustling of branches too fast to be natural, like something large was moving through the trees just beyond our sight. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the dark blur of the woods. The deeper we went, the more disoriented I became. The trees seemed to shift, the path no longer familiar, as if the woods were changing around us. I tried to call out to Jason, but my voice was strangled, lost in the thick air. Then, ahead of us, I saw it, a clearing. There was no trail leading into it, but somehow we had found it. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk wide and gnarled, its roots twisted into the earth like a clawed hand. The air around it felt wrong, heavy. It was as if this tree wasn't part of the forest at all, but something else entirely, something ancient. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the branches of the tree were figures, at least a dozen, their bodies twisted and contorted in impossible ways, their limbs hanging from the branches like rag dolls. Their faces were obscured, but I could feel their eyes on us, cold and unblinking. "Jason," I breathed, barely able to speak. My voice cracked. "What is that?" Jason didn't answer. He was staring at the figures, his face pale, his lips trembling. "Please," he whispered, "we shouldn't have come." I didn't know what to do. The whispering started again, faint at first, then growing louder. The figures in the tree began to move, their limbs jerking unnaturally, like they were waking up. I didn't want to wait to see what they would do next. I grabbed Jason's arm, pulling him away from the clearing. But as we turned to leave, something stopped me, something cold and wet on my hand. I looked down to see my hand covered in dark, sticky liquid. It wasn't blood, but it felt wrong, slimy and thick. When I looked up, I saw that the tree's roots were moving, crawling toward us, like they had a mind of their own. "Run!" I screamed, but Jason was already a step ahead of me. We bolted, pushing through the dense underbrush, but the roots were faster. They wrapped around our legs, pulling us back, dragging us toward the tree. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the more I struggled, the tighter they became. Jason reached for me, his hand just out of my grasp. "Get off!" I cried, but it was no use. The roots pulled us closer, and the figures above us began to shift, reaching down with long, twisted limbs. And then the voice returned. "Stay with us." I don't remember how we escaped. I don't know how we made it back to the car, but when we did, we didn't speak. We didn't look back. We didn't even stop to catch our breath. I never went hiking again after that day. I don't know what we disturbed in those woods, but I know that it wasn't meant to be found. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting for the next curious souls to wander too deep.
Next story.
I still don't know what happened that day. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip with a few friends. Nothing too crazy, but it turned into something I wish I could forget. I've tried to push it out of my mind, but the nightmares keep coming back. Every time I close my eyes, I can see it. It started off so innocently. We were a group of 4, me, my best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Jason, and our friend Mark. We'd been planning the trip for weeks, a weekend hike through the remote forest near the Smoky Mountains. We'd heard great things about the area, beautiful trails, calm streams, perfect for camping and just getting away from everything. We arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, excited to escape our busy lives for a while. The trail we chose was secluded and known to be quiet, which was exactly what we wanted. A few miles in, and we'd set up camp beside a small stream with no one around for miles. The first night was exactly as we expected. Peaceful. The fire crackled, the air was cool, and we all shared stories, laughed, and enjoyed being in nature. But as the fire began to die down and we settled into our tents for the night, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was the quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making you feel like you're being watched. I brushed it off. I was probably just tired from the hike. But as I lay in my tent trying to sleep, I heard something, a faint rustling outside. I sat up straight, my heart racing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer just sniffing around. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer. I unzipped the tent cautiously, sticking my head out. The moonlight was dim and the forest was still, except for the soft rush of the stream. I didn't see anything, no animals, no movement, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. I quickly zipped the tent back up and tried to get some sleep, but my mind kept racing. I was convinced someone or something was out there. The next morning, I didn't mention it to the others. I figured it was probably just my imagination. But as we ate breakfast and packed up for another day of hiking, I noticed something strange. The campfire had been disturbed. The logs were scattered, and there were deep, deliberate marks in the dirt, as if something had clawed at it. I asked the group if anyone had gotten up during the night, but no one had. We all stayed in our tents the entire time. I felt a chill run down my spine, but again, I told myself it was nothing. The forest is unpredictable, and animals can sometimes make strange marks. We spent the day hiking deeper into the woods. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees and brush, but we were all in good spirits. The deeper we went, though, the quieter the forest became. It was as if the usual sounds of wildlife had simply stopped. The birds weren't chirping, and there was no rustling of leaves. Even the wind had died down. Around midday, we reached a clearing. It was beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. We decided to take a break and have lunch. That's when we saw the first sign that something was really wrong. At the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind some bushes, was a tree. The tree itself wasn't anything special. It was just a regular oak. But the ground around it was disturbed. The dirt was uneven, and there were strange, deep impressions in the earth, like something had been dragged across the ground. I walked closer, my curiosity getting the better of me. As I reached the tree, I noticed something strange in the bark. Symbols. They weren't carved in a regular pattern. They were haphazard, almost chaotic, like they'd been scratched into the tree by something desperate. The symbols were unfamiliar to me, and I couldn't make sense of them. I glanced back at the others, but they didn't seem to notice. Sarah and Jason were talking about something, while Mark was stretching by the stream. But then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, movement in the trees. A figure. I blinked and looked again, but it was gone. Did anyone else see that? I asked, my voice trembling. See what? Sarah replied, looking at me with a puzzled expression. I thought I saw someone over there, I said, pointing toward the trees. But when they looked, there was nothing. I felt a strange sense of dread settle in my stomach, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I kept it to myself. We finished our lunch and decided to head back to camp, but the feeling of being watched never left. That night, we made sure to stay closer to the fire. We talked for a while, like conned, but no one really seemed to be in the mood for jokes. The atmosphere felt wrong. The air was still, and I kept hearing soft footsteps in the woods around us. But every time I checked, there was nothing. I was the first to turn in, but sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise had me sitting up in my tent, straining to listen. I heard the rustling again, followed by a low growl, something too deep to be an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, scanning the darkness. Nothing. The next morning, when we all woke up, something was different. Mark was gone. His tent was empty, his sleeping bag folded neatly as if he had left voluntarily. But we didn't hear him leave. We hadn't heard anything during the night, and his flashlight was still by the fire, untouched. We called out for him, but no answer. I felt my stomach tighten with fear. Mark? Come on, this isn't funny, Jason yelled, but there was no response. We searched the area, retracing our steps, but there was no sign of him. No tracks, no disturbance. It was like he had vanished into thin air. As panic set in, Sarah started to cry. I tried to stay calm, but the terror in my chest was growing. Something was wrong. Something unnatural was happening. We packed up our things, intending to head out of the woods, but as we made our way back to the trail, I kept hearing the same footsteps from the night before. But when I turned around, there was never anyone there. Finally, as we neared the trailhead, I caught a glimpse of something strange. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. It was too far to make out any details, but it was there, and it was still. I froze, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw Mark's face. But it couldn't have been him. His eyes were wide, terrified, like someone who had seen something they couldn't explain. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished back into the trees. We didn't speak another word as we rushed out of the forest. When we finally made it back to the car, I didn't look back. I don't know what happened to Mark. We never found him, and when we reported him missing, the search teams came up empty-handed. It was like he had disappeared completely. I've tried to rationalize it, tried to tell myself it was just a freak accident, but deep down, I know it wasn't. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see the symbols on that tree and hear those footsteps behind me. I never want to go back to those woods. I never want to see whatever took Mark again. But something tells me it's still out there, waiting.
Next story.
I didn't want to go on that hike, but I didn't have a choice. My friends had been planning it for weeks, and when I was invited to join, I felt bad saying no. It seemed like a simple trip, just a few miles on a well-marked trail in the woods. The kind of thing people do to get away from the grind. I should have known better. We parked at the trailhead early enough to avoid the midday sun and set out with our backpacks filled with snacks, water, and the usual gear. There were 5 of us: me, my brother, Tom, his girlfriend, Sarah, and our 2 friends, Ben and Kyle. We joked around as we hiked, making fun of each other's gear and talking about random things. The trail was peaceful. The trees were tall and green, the air was crisp, and the sounds of birds and wind in the leaves filled the air. But as we went further in, I began to notice something odd. The woods started to feel off. It wasn't that anything seemed particularly strange, but it was more like a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The further we walked, the less it felt like we were in a natural forest. It started feeling wrong, like the trees were closing in on us, like we were being watched. I didn't say anything to the others at first. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But when Sarah suddenly stopped, looking around, I knew she felt it too. "I swear, I heard something," she said quietly. We all froze, looking at her. But she wasn't the type to get scared easily, but her eyes were wide. I looked around, trying to figure out what she meant, but the woods were still and silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just that heavy, thick quiet. "I didn't hear anything," Tom said, shrugging. "Probably just a squirrel or something." "Maybe," Sarah muttered, but she didn't look convinced. We continued walking, but now we were all a little more on edge. The trail was narrowing, the trees getting thicker, and I couldn't help but feel like we were going deeper into something. It was hard to explain, but the woods felt like they were growing darker. Even though the sun was still high in the sky, it felt like dusk had already fallen. Then Ben, the most skeptical of us all, spoke up. "All right, this is getting weird. We've been on this trail for hours, and it doesn't seem to end. We should have turned back by now." "I thought you said it was a loop?" Kyle said. "Yeah," Ben replied, his voice low. "It is, but we've missed several markers. Something's wrong." I glanced back at the trail, and he was right. There was no sign of where we'd come from, no markers on the trees, nothing that indicated we were heading in the right direction, just more and more of the same endless woods. "We'll be fine," I said, trying to brush off the growing sense of dread. "Maybe we took a wrong turn. Let's just keep going and look for a sign or something." But Ben wasn't convinced. "I don't think this is just a wrong turn. We've been walking in circles, haven't we?" Tom rolled his eyes. "You're overthinking it. Let's just keep going." We pushed on, but the sense of unease grew. It wasn't just the lack of markers now. The trees were strange, their trunks unnaturally twisted, their branches reaching out like fingers, and the air, it felt thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. The others were quieter now too, more cautious. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it. A sound. Soft at first, like a low whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer. A voice. "Help?" It was faint, almost a breath, but we all heard it. We stopped dead in our tracks. "Did you hear that?" Kyle whispered, his face pale. "Yeah," I said, my heart pounding. "It came from over there." I pointed toward a dense thicket of trees. The air felt colder now, and that whisper was still lingering, calling out for help. "It's probably someone else on the trail," Ben said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Or it's someone who's lost," Sarah suggested, looking uneasy. We stood there for a few moments, listening to the faint whisper. It didn't sound like someone in trouble. It didn't sound real. It sounded hollow, distant. But then again, I couldn't ignore it. Someone could be out there, and we had to help. Without saying a word, I began walking toward the sound. The others followed, hesitantly, each of us feeling the strange, unnerving pull of whatever was calling us. The whisper grew louder as we approached, clearer but still distant. It wasn't until we reached a small clearing that we saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe someone in distress, but as we stepped closer, I realized it wasn't human. The figure was hunched over, its body unnaturally twisted, like it had been contorted into the shape of something wrong. Its skin was pale, stretched over its bones in an unnatural way. The eyes, those black, hollow eyes, stared at us from behind the mess of tangled hair that hung in its face. "Please," the thing croaked, its voice a raspy whisper. "Help." We froze, terror gripping us. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. It was something else, something wrong. Its mouth opened wider, the sound coming from deep within its throat like a hollow, echoing scream. But no sound came out, just that low, rasping whisper. "Get out of here!" Ben shouted, grabbing Kyle's arm. "Run?" I yelled. But it was too late. The figure lurched toward us, its body jerking in unnatural ways. Its hands, elongated and twisted, reached out, grabbing at the air. And then the ground beneath us started to shake. The trees around us creaked and groaned, and the very air seemed to thicken with malice. We turned and ran. Every footstep, every breath was a desperate scramble to get away from whatever that thing was. But the woods seemed endless. The trees seemed to shift, to move around us, trapping us in their grip. I could hear the thing behind us, dragging itself along the ground, its whisper growing louder, more insistent. It was following us, relentlessly. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like hours, but I couldn't focus on anything except getting out. The woods, however, seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't until we finally broke through a thicket of trees that we saw the trail again, the path we had come from. We didn't stop. We ran straight to the parking lot, not daring to look back. When we reached the car, breathless and shaken, we piled in, slamming the doors behind us. None of us spoke for a long time. We couldn't. The silence in the car was deafening, filled with the sound of our ragged breathing and the lingering bone-deep terror that wouldn't leave us. We drove away, never looking back. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in those woods, but I know this. The thing we saw wasn't human. And whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting for the next group of hikers to wander too deep. I'll never go back into those woods again. And neither will my friends.
Next story.
I've always loved hiking, especially in remote places where the only sounds are the wind and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I've hiked all over the country, from the deserts of Arizona to the forests of Oregon, but it was a small, lesser-known trail in North Carolina that would change my life forever. I had heard about the trail from a friend who said it was a bit off the beaten path, not very well traveled, and had a sort of mystical reputation. People in the area talked about it in hushed voices, but no one ever gave concrete details. The trail was called the Hollow's End, and it supposedly led to an old abandoned cabin deep in the forest. At first, I thought it sounded like a great adventure. I wanted solitude, a chance to clear my head, and a few days away from the chaos of everyday life. So one morning, I packed my backpack with camping gear, food, and water and set out to explore. The trail was as described, secluded, winding through thick trees and dense underbrush. The further I went, the more the world around me seemed to close in. Birds stopped chirping, and the wind died down. Even the sunlight seemed reluctant to penetrate the canopy. The atmosphere was heavy, almost oppressive. But I pressed on. I'd been hiking for a few hours when I noticed something odd, a series of small stone markers along the path. At first, they seemed like harmless trail markers, but the further I walked, the more unusual they became. Each stone was engraved with strange symbols that I couldn't decipher. Some of them had faint carvings, almost like writing, but the characters looked ancient, not anything from modern languages. I chalked it up to the locals or hikers who had left their mark over time. But then I noticed something even stranger. At one point, I came across a large stone arch, half hidden by vines, that appeared to be an entrance to something, like a doorway. It wasn't part of any trail map, and it wasn't something I'd read about in any hiking guides. The arch seemed to lead deeper into the forest, but the trees surrounding it looked twisted, like they had been contorted by time. There was an eerie quiet around it, almost like the air was holding its breath. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to go through. I had a sense that it wasn't a part of any regular trail and that something about it didn't belong in the natural world. But curiosity got the better of me. What was the harm? I'd come this far, after all. As soon as I passed through the arch, the atmosphere shifted. It was as though I had stepped into a different world entirely. The trees were darker here, and the air felt colder, denser. The ground beneath my boots was spongy, as though it had soaked up something from beneath. The path became less defined, the forest denser. And there in the distance I saw the cabin. It was decrepit, old, and half-rotted, but there was something undeniably unsettling about it. The way it stood, half hidden in the trees, gave off the feeling that it didn't belong, that it had been abandoned long before anyone thought to leave it behind. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. I decided to investigate. I approached the cabin cautiously, my every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to leave this place. The door was cracked open, and I could see inside through the gap. The interior was dark and musty, covered in dust. There were old, rotting furniture scattered around, a table, a few chairs, some broken shelves. It was completely empty. Nothing seemed to indicate that anyone had been here in years, but something about the place felt alive in a way. It was then that I noticed the symbols carved into the wood of the doorframe, the same markings I had seen on the stone markers along the trail. I wasn't sure what they meant, but the unease I felt intensified. I couldn't leave without looking around more. The door creaked open under my touch, and I stepped inside. The room smelled of rot and decay. There was a small fireplace on one wall, its hearth cold and empty. A strange, thick black stain spread across the floor near the center of the room, as if someone had once bled out in this very spot. I turned around to leave, but that's when I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, coming from the corner of the room. It sounded like a voice, low and guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows of the room, stretching across the walls like fingers. My breath caught in my throat as the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled and yanked, but the door was stuck. Panic set in. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. It was hunched over, its back turned to me, and it was rocking back and forth slowly. It was hard to make out its features out, but its skin was gray and weathered, like leather that had been left out in the sun for too long. It was covered in tattered, filthy clothes, and it was whispering something. A low, eerie chant. I could feel the weight of its presence, its eyes never leaving me, though I could not see its face. My pulse raced as I backed away slowly, my hands trembling as I felt for the door again. My fingers brushed against the cold handle, but it still wouldn't open. The figure began to rise, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on broken strings. I felt the temperature drop suddenly, a chill seeping into my bones as the thing turned its head slowly, revealing its face. There was no face, just a hollow, dark void, like an endless black abyss. It was staring at me, and I felt my heart stop. I screamed and slammed my shoulder into the door, finally breaking it open with a crack. I stumbled out into the woods, running without looking back. I didn't care anymore about the trail or the path back to safety. I just needed to get away. I ran for what felt like hours, never looking behind me, and when I finally made it back to the main trail, I collapsed, gasping for breath. I couldn't explain what had happened or what that thing had been, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back to those woods. I still don't know what that place was or what I saw, but every time I think about that day, I hear the whispering again, just faintly, like a distant memory, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered, it's still out there, waiting.
Next story.
It was a decision I regretted the moment I stepped off the main trail. It seemed harmless enough at first. I had always been an avid hiker, but this was the first time I had ventured into the woods alone. I had heard so many stories about people losing themselves in the vast wilderness, but I never thought it could happen to me. How wrong I was. It was early fall when I decided to explore the forest near where I lived. The days were still warm, but the evenings were starting to carry a chill that made the idea of an adventure in the woods more inviting. I had heard about a trail that led to an old, forgotten cabin deep in the forest, a place that people rarely visited anymore. The stories about it were conflicting. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it was just an old structure used by hunters long ago. But either way, it sounded interesting enough to check out. I parked my car at the trailhead, grabbed my gear, and set off early that morning. The trail was well marked at first, a winding path that led deeper into the trees. As the hours passed, the sounds of the outside world faded, and all I could hear was the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. It was beautiful, peaceful, but after a while I began to feel isolated. Not just in a quiet way, but in a way that made me uneasy. The deeper I went, the more the woods felt alive, as if the trees were watching me, listening to my every move. At some point, I noticed a faint, narrow trail cutting off from the main one. It wasn't marked, but it seemed like it led in the right direction toward the cabin. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take the side path, thinking I could always turn back if it led me nowhere. The trail was rougher, overgrown with brambles and thorny bushes. It was harder to follow, and the deeper I went, the thicker the trees became, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air started to feel heavier, almost suffocating, as though I was walking through something that didn't want me there. I pushed forward, thinking of the old cabin, excited to see what I'd find. The further I went, though, the more I began to feel something wasn't quite right. The silence was unnerving. There were no birds, no squirrels, no sounds of life. Even the wind had stopped. It was like I was in a dead zone, a place where nature itself had gone silent. And then I saw it. The cabin. It was hidden among the trees, barely visible unless you were standing directly in front of it. The structure looked ancient, its wood warped and weathered by time. The windows were boarded up and the door was barely hanging on its hinges. It looked abandoned, yet there was an unsettling feeling about it. Something told me I should turn around, leave it alone. But my curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped forward, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed in the stillness. The inside was pitch black. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, scanning the room. The cabin was small, empty, and covered in dust. There were old, decaying furniture scattered around, chairs, a broken table, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in decades. I wandered deeper into the cabin, shining my light on the walls. That's when I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were markings, strange symbols carved into the wooden walls, faded but still visible. Some of them were simple lines and circles, but others were more intricate, almost like a language I couldn't understand. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I traced my finger along the markings. I didn't know what they meant, but I had a feeling they weren't something you were supposed to find in a place like this. Then I heard something. A whisper. It was faint at first, but as it grew louder, I could hear words. "Leave this place." I froze. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one. The whispering didn't stop, though. It was coming from inside the walls, echoing around me, circling through the room like it was trapped in the cabin itself. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I knew I had to leave, but as I reached the door, I heard something else. A soft, almost inaudible scratching noise from behind me. I turned around, but there was no movement, nothing out of the ordinary. The scratching sound continued, growing louder. It was coming from the walls, like something was trying to claw its way through the wood. I ran. I didn't care about the door or the path I came through. I just ran out of the cabin, my feet pounding the earth beneath me. As I stumbled back onto the path, I could hear the whispering again, faintly calling my name, beckoning me back. I didn't stop running until I reached the main trail again, my breath ragged and my body trembling. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I glanced over my shoulder, I saw something. A shadow standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, and I knew it wasn't human. I kept moving, my legs burning, but the shadow seemed to follow me. Always just out of reach. It wasn't until I reached the car that I dared to look back again. The shadow was gone, but the air around me still felt heavy. I never went back to that forest, and I never spoke about it to anyone. People who hike there still talk about the abandoned cabin, but they don't know the full story. The stories about it being haunted, they're not exaggerations. There's something out there, something that doesn't want people to find that cabin. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that it's still watching me. Every time I go to sleep, I hear the whispering, soft and insistent, as though it's calling me back. And sometimes, just before I close my eyes, I swear I can feel that shadow, waiting for me to return. I don't think I'll ever truly escape it.
Next story.
I've always been an outdoors person. There's something about being in the woods, away from the noise of the world, that makes everything feel so right. A weekend hike on a trail I'd never tried before had been my plan for the past few weeks. My friend Sam, an experienced hiker, convinced me to join him on this particular trail, a remote one in the Smoky Mountains. According to Sam, it was one of those rare spots that wasn't overrun by tourists or day trippers. Peaceful, quiet, perfect for disconnecting. I didn't know much about the trail itself, other than that it had a reputation for being secluded and a bit rugged. We packed our gear and drove up together, excited for the weekend away from city life. As we began the hike, everything seemed normal. Lush green forest, the smell of pine, birds singing in the distance. The sun was filtering through the canopy, casting dappled light on the ground, and everything felt peaceful. Sam was leading the way, still chatting about some previous hiking adventures, but I wasn't paying much attention. My focus was on the trail and how the deeper we went into the woods, the quieter everything seemed. It was subtle at first, the silence, but soon it became undeniable. There were no birds chirping, no rustling in the underbrush, not even the sound of wind in the trees, the kind of silence you could feel like the woods were holding their breath. Sam noticed it too. "It's like everything's gone dead silent," he said, looking around. I gave a nervous laugh. "Maybe it's just a quiet part of the forest." He didn't seem convinced. "Maybe. Or maybe we've wandered into something else." At first, I thought he was joking. Sam was always the one to say creepy things to get a reaction out of me, but this time his voice was serious and his eyes darted nervously between the trees. We continued walking, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't the usual unease you get when you're alone in the woods. It was deeper. The air felt heavier, and the stillness seemed unnatural. At one point, Sam stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I didn't hear anything at first, but then it came again, a faint scraping noise, like something being dragged across the ground. It was distant, but it echoed through the trees, sending a shiver up my spine. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sam looked around, his eyes wide. "I don't know, but I don't like it." We stood there for a moment, frozen, listening. But the noise stopped, just as suddenly as it had started. We exchanged uneasy glances, but decided to keep moving. The trail grew more rugged as we climbed higher, but it was still manageable. We came across a small creek, and Sam suggested we take a break and refill our water bottles. I agreed, grateful for the excuse to sit and take a breather. That's when we saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shape standing between the trees, barely visible through the thick trunks. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with a hunched posture. But it wasn't a person. I could tell that much immediately. Its limbs were too long and its body too twisted. It stood motionless, watching us. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. "Sam, do you see that?" I whispered, but my voice barely escaped. Sam's face went pale as he turned slowly to look at me. "What the hell is that?" The figure didn't move, just stared at us with eyes that were too large, too dark. We couldn't see its face clearly. There was just an impression of something wrong, something off. I couldn't tear my eyes away, but Sam grabbed my arm, yanking me back toward the creek. "We need to go," he said urgently, his voice shaky. "Now." I didn't need any further encouragement. Nah. We grabbed our packs and bolted down the trail, our breathing heavy, our hearts racing. I didn't look back. Not once. I could feel it, though, like something was following us, just beyond the trees, always just out of sight. The sound of footsteps, dragging, slow, deliberate, seemed to echo behind us. We didn't stop until we reached the clearing near the trailhead, where we finally dared to slow down. Our bodies were trembling from the fear and the effort of running, but the trail had gone silent again, eerily so. We kept our eyes on the path ahead, unwilling to speak, unwilling to acknowledge what we had seen. As we caught our breath, I noticed something strange. There was an old wooden sign at the edge of the clearing that I didn't remember seeing before. It had been partially covered by overgrown ivy, but it was still legible. The name of the trail was still visible, except instead of the usual trail name, there was something else carved into the wood. "Leave now." I felt a cold chill run through me. Sam took a step forward and reached out to touch the sign, but the moment his hand brushed against it, he froze. His face went slack, his eyes wide in disbelief. "What?" I asked, but I could already see the change in him. His voice came out in a strained whisper. I don't remember that sign being there." I glanced back at the path, suddenly feeling the overwhelming urge to leave. The woods felt like they were closing in, the air thick and suffocating. The feeling of being watched hadn't left, it had only intensified. "We're getting out of here," I said firmly, grabbing Sam's arm and pulling him toward the car. The walk back was a blur, my mind spinning, my body on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. We made it back to the car without incident, but neither of us spoke much on the drive home. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the rearview mirror, something that had followed us from the woods. Since that day, I haven't returned to the Smoky Mountains. I've never spoken about it much to anyone, because who would believe us? But Sam and I both know what we saw. That thing, whatever it wasn't human. It was something ancient, something that shouldn't be in the woods. And that sign, I can't stop thinking about it. The words still echo in my mind, leave now.